think this is where we ended. I didn't quite get to this slide yet. So we're going into organic macromolecules today, which will hopefully kind of be a review for a lot of people. But first I want to talk about, before we talk about the macromolecules, the idea of metabolism, basically breaking down and building these macromolecules in the body, along with a lot of other stuff going on. But if we define metabolism, it's the sum of two parts, anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism is the building up of big molecules. Catabolism is the breaking down. These are all of the chemical reactions happening in your body, basically. So metabolism is all of the chemical reactions occurring. You may have heard the terms endergonic and exergonic or seen them in the textbook. I don't really use them in this class, but if they're helpful for you to remember what anabolism is versus catabolism, feel free. Anabolism is, like I said, the building up of polymers. So we're going to talk about monomers and polymers today. Polymers are the bigger molecules that are built from the individual pieces, which are monomers. That takes energy. So it takes energy to build something big, right? That is anabolism. Something is being synthesized, a bigger molecule is being synthesized from its individual smaller component pieces. Catabolism is just the opposite. So catabolism is the breaking down of a big molecule, a polymer, into its individual component pieces. When you break something down, you chop it all up into little pieces, it releases a lot of energy. So you have something that takes energy, something that releases energy, in the end, kind of evens out. That is anabolism and catabolism. I'm not going to go into details about exactly what reactions are happening here. I think that's beyond what we need to talk about. As long as you understand that metabolism is the building up and the breaking down and what the terms are for those two processes, I think that's fine for this class. Okay. Any questions about that? Next, we're going to do a very relatively quick review of the biological macromolecule categories. So here we're talking about organic chemistry, essentially. Organic chemistry is just anything that, it's chemistry that involves carbon. That's an easy way to think about it. All of these compounds that we'll talk about, or all of these molecules that we'll talk about, have carbon as the main component. Hopefully these look familiar if you've taken general biology here or somewhere else. Hopefully these look kind of familiar: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Those are the four big categories of biological macromolecules. These are what make up most of us. If you put together some atoms and some elements, they're going to form typically one of these four major compounds. Molecules, sorry, I guess compounds. I'm going to go through each of these fairly quickly, just kind of telling you the general characteristics of each. And then if there's any specific examples that I want you to know, I'll have them on the slides as well. All right, so we're going to start with carbohydrates. For each of these, I'll talk about the monomers and the polymers. I just mentioned those terms on the previous slide. Monomers are going to be the individual subunits. Mono means one, poly means many. So if you put together a bunch of monomers, you get a polymer. I'll talk about the names for each of these. They're referred to as macromolecules because they're really big. Macro typically refers to big. Obviously, this is relative. We're still talking molecules, which are tiny. Micro means small, macro means big. These are big molecules compared to a lot of others that we find. Great. So yeah, we'll talk about proteins and the amino acids. That's a good example though of a polymer. But I'll get into monomers and polymers for most of these categories that I'm about to go into. I'll tell you the names of them and then any examples that you need to know. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I think most people have heard this, but slow me down or ask me questions if you're like totally overwhelmed, okay? Before we get into carbohydrates, I want to mention a few functional groups that you should be familiar with. Functional groups are generally groups of elements or atoms that you see occurring together often. There's a bunch of them. There's only 5 here that I think will come up in these biological macromolecules regularly. So these are the 5 I want you to be familiar with, know their names, and then be able to identify them based on the elements that are involved. The importance over here, if that helps you kind of remember something about their structural formula or their name, that's for kind of your knowledge, but I'm not going to ask you specifically the characteristics that they impart to these different molecules. So you don't have to worry about the importance unless it's of interest to you. First, we have hydroxyl. That's just an oxygen and a hydrogen, OH. We'll see those a bunch. Hydroxyl group. A carboxyl. Basically a hydroxyl. There's the OH with another carbon and oxygen coming off of it. So carboxyl and hydroxyl are pretty similar. And I'll show you what these look like coming off of these macromolecules so you can identify them. An amino group, really we're only going to see these in amino acids, which make proteins. This is the only one with nitrogen in it that you need to know. So a nitrogen and then 2 hydrogens attached to it makes an amino group. Methyl groups occur a lot. They are a carbon with 3 hydrogens. And then phosphate, it's the only one with phosphorus, that's easy. A phosphorus and then 4 oxygens. Those are negatively charged. You don't need to worry about the negative charge on phosphate for our purposes. Just be able, if you see a phosphorus with 4 oxygens around it, you'll know it's a phosphate group. So if I show you a molecule and there's a carboxyl group sticking off one end of it and I circle it, I want you to be able to identify what that is. If I say, what functional group is this? That's kind of what I'm going for here. If you're wondering what exactly you need to know, the name and then the formula, what are involved. I think I cut this down from what's in your textbook. So these are the 5 that I think you should know. If you want to know more, feel free. Now carbohydrates. Now we're getting into carbs. Carbs are pretty simple. Generally, they have 2 hydrogens for every 1 carbon and oxygen. So they have, in their molecular formula, they have a C, an H, and an O. The number of hydrogens in this example of glucose is double the number of carbons and oxygen. So CH2O is kind of the general formula. Some multiple of that is going to be the formula for a carbohydrate. You want to know glucose, C6H12O6. Just know that as the molecular formula for glucose. Glucose is one of the most common monomers of a carbohydrate. They are hydrophilic. Does anyone remember what hydrophilic means? Water loving. Yeah. So philic refers to loving. Phobic would be fearing, right? Good. I was hoping we'd lose power.
Why would we keep losing power?
I don't know. Did it? It was flickering upstairs in the hallway.
Yeah, it was flipping right here.
Really?
She was like moved a wire and she was very confused. Dr. Godwin, and then the light kept flickering.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, power's totally out, right? Okay, well. I assume, is the Wi-Fi out too? I'm probably not zooming anymore.
No. That's like the Wi-Fi doesn't go out until like 5 minutes after.
Oh, really? Okay, well, I'm gonna keep talking. We'll see if the power comes back on. Oh, I do have markers. Okay. So this will just slow us down a little bit. That's okay. All right. Carbohydrates. So hydrophilic means water loving. That means they're going to mix with water. They don't repel it. Lipids are going to repel water basically when we get into lipids. What else do I have on here? Right. So the monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. You want to know that term. And what would the polymer be called? Would you guess? Polysaccharide, yeah. So one piece of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, two pieces is a two or more is a polysaccharide. We'll talk about kind of an in-between. A disaccharide. I'm going to give you some examples of that. Disaccharide is obviously two. Okay. We have three important monosaccharides that you want to know. I already mentioned one. What's one? C6H12O6, glucose, yeah. So there's going to be three of these, three monosaccharides. You're going to want to know the names. I have the structures that you'll see in a second when this comes back on. You don't need to know the structures, just know the names and know they're monosaccharides. So glucose, galactose. That's the third one I'm having you learn. Fructose. Notice they're all oses. If you see ose, think it's some kind of carbohydrate. Ose usually means sweet or sugary, and carbohydrates are kind of commonly referred to as sugars. All of these are, if you wrote out their molecular formula, they're all C6H12O6. They have the same number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens as each other, but they are different molecules because they're just arranged slightly differently. Like I said, I'm not going to ask you to look at the structure and tell me what it is. So we're not going to go into how they're different. But on the slide, you can, once it comes up, you can kind of see how they're just slightly different. Same formula though. So three monosaccharides you want to know. There's two disaccharides. You guys have these. I'm going to erase these. Actually, I'm going to erase this here. I'm going to leave the monosaccharides up there. No, whoops, that's not working. F1 to retry boot. Yeah. That works. Sorry, three monosaccharides. I have three disaccharides that you want to know too. So three disaccharides, this is just two monosaccharides, two of these put together. First, sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide. All of these disaccharides are glucose plus something else, plus one of the other two that I mentioned. So sucrose is glucose plus fructose. And this is table sugar. So if you put sugar in anything, you're using sucrose. It's a disaccharide. It's a combination of glucose and fructose. The next one is lactose. What is lactose found in? Milk. Yeah, if you're lactose intolerant, your body basically can't digest this sugar. So in milk, lactose is made of glucose again. And then what would you guess the other one down here it would be made of? Galactose, yeah. Glucose plus galactose. And then our last one is going to be maltose. This is in grain products, so like beer. Maltose is, sorry, this is why I don't like writing on the board. I always end up mushing stuff together. Glucose plus, yeah, glucose, good. The only other option, right? So we've done the other two. Glucose and glucose, that's maltose. So those are the three monosaccharides you want to know. You want to know how they combine to make these three disaccharides. And then I'll talk about a few polysaccharides. There's one polysaccharide that we talk about in general biology that I don't talk about here because humans don't have it or ingest it in any form, but I'll talk about the other three. So here you see the monomers, the monosaccharides that I talked about. The disaccharides, again, you don't need to know the structure, just know the names and the individual monomers that make them up. And then the polysaccharides here are one we make, the other two are from plants, but we ingest them in our diets, hopefully. So glycogen is our form, that's how we store carbohydrates in our body. So glycogen is a lot of glucose molecules strung together essentially. So all of these little green polygons are glucose molecules. If we don't need energy right away from whatever we just ate, if there's carbohydrates in it, our body will link a lot of these glucose molecules together and store them oftentimes in our liver as glycogen. So it's an energy storage. Starch is energy storage, but in plants. So that's how they put their carbohydrates into storage as starch. A potato is a bunch of starch, right? So we eat starch all the time, and we can break it down and use it for energy. And then cellulose is a very, very strong polysaccharide that is found in plant cell walls. The reason it matters to us is because it's a really important source of fiber in our diets. So it's not energy, but it cleans out the digestive system. We can't digest it, but it cleans us out. And that's how we typically, that's why cellulose can be important in our diets. So glycogen, starch, cellulose. Those are the three polysaccharides you want to know. That's all I have on carbohydrates. That's all you need to know about carbohydrates moving forward in here. Any questions so far? On to lipids. Lipids don't really have a monomer, a unique monomer. The only thing that groups them together is that they're hydrophobic. Hydrophobic meaning they are scared of water or they repel water. So these are the fats and oils in our bodies. They're much more calorie rich than carbohydrates. So if you eat 1 gram of fat versus 1 gram of carbohydrate, you get more calories, obviously more energy from fat. Be good or bad? There's 5 main types that are found in humans. You've probably, at least in general bio, heard of at least the first 3, and you've probably heard the word steroid before, even if it wasn't covered in general biology. So we're going to talk about each of these pretty briefly. Fatty acids and triglycerides are very closely related. They're really similar. Phospholipids, does anyone remember where phospholipids are found in the body? Cell membrane, yeah. So they make up most of the cell membrane. So we have trillions of cells in our body, and phospholipids make up the vast majority of the membrane around each of those cells. So they're really important. Eicosanoids are probably a type of lipid you haven't heard of before. They're similar to steroids. Steroids and eicosanoids are both signaling molecules in large part. So they'll send messages around the body. And we'll talk about each of these on the next 5 slides. To start with, fatty acids are basically a long chain of carbons with hydrogens attached to most of the carbons. So lots of carbons, lots of hydrogens. At one end, so here's our first functional group coming into play. You have a carboxyl group. So this is what a carboxyl group looks like coming off of one of the macromolecules. You have the C bonded to an OH, and then you have it bonded to a double bonded to an oxygen on the other side. So that COOH, that's the carboxyl group. That's always at one end of a fatty acid. At the other end of the fatty acid, you have a methyl group, CH3. That's another one of the functional groups you need to know. It's a little harder to pick out because it just looks kind of like all the rest, but you have a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached. That makes it a methyl. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about the fatty acids or triglycerides. I just want you to be able to recognize their structure and identify them. Triglycerides. Now we have 3 fatty acid chains, hence the tri. 3 fatty acid chains. So same thing we just talked about, long chain of carbon with hydrogen coming off. So 3 of those attached to a glycerol backbone. So glycerol is what you really want to remember here. You want to remember the 3 fatty acids, but that's kind of easy. Glycerol backbone, you have 3 carbons. Off of each of those carbons is a fatty acid chain. Triglycerides are really important in energy storage in our body. And I'm not going to go into saturated versus unsaturated fats here, but this is kind of the fatty acid area is where that would come in. If you're curious about that, I can tell you at some point, or it's probably in your book. But you can see here, this is listed as an unsaturated fat. So fatty acids and triglycerides, pretty similar. Phospholipids, similar but slightly different. Now we have fatty acid chains still. So we have these 2 tails coming off are fatty acid chains, so carbons and hydrogens. You still have glycerol as kind of a backbone here, so 3 carbons you can see. But then up top you have a phosphate group. I'm not going to talk about the nitrogen even, but phosphate makes it the phospholipid. So here's our phosphate group. That's one of the functional groups that I mentioned. Like you guys already said, these are really important in plasma membranes. So we're going to start, hopefully, to get into the cell chapter today. And I'll talk about phospholipids in the plasma membrane. But here, just 2 fatty acid tails, glycerol backbone, and then a phosphate group on top. On to icosanoids. So these might be the ones that you're a little bit less familiar with. Again, a long chain of carbons, but at the end, there's typically a ring. So the carbons, rather than just being in a long chain, at the end, they'll form a ring. Why that happens, I'm not going to go into, but it's a bunch of carbons forming a ring, basically. What I really want you to know with icosanoids are sort of their purpose in the body. And as I mentioned before, they mostly just send signals around the body. So these molecules will move around, sending specific signals regarding some of these processes you see here. So blood clotting, if you get a cut and your blood needs to clot to stop the bleeding, icosanoids will be sent to that area of the body to encourage blood clotting. Hormone action. Hormones are also signaling molecules. I'll talk about them on the next slide, but icosanoids will sometimes lead to the release of hormones. Hormones will send messages to different parts of the body. Labor contractions, pretty closely related. That's very hormonally driven. And then blood vessel diameter, which doesn't seem like it would matter that much, but that's what a lot of what controls a person's blood pressure. So blood pressure is going to come up pretty often. The way to change blood pressure is to either one way is to increase the diameter of blood vessels. So think of it like a hose. If you increase the diameter of the blood vessel, what is that going to do to blood pressure? Increase it or decrease it? If you make the opening bigger. Decrease, yeah. So you open the blood vessel, it's going to decrease blood pressure. If the blood vessel constricts and gets smaller, that's going to increase blood pressure. So just by changing our blood vessels are changing diameter pretty often. Just by changing that, we can change our blood pressure. Icosanoids are part of what controls that. The last category, steroids, they're also called sterols. We have rings again. So now typically we have 4 rings, 4 carbon rings with a tiny little hydrocarbon tail coming off the back end. So sort of similar in structure to icosanoids with the ring and the tail. All of the steroids in our bodies originate from cholesterol. So cholesterol is called the parent steroid. Cholesterol is changed in order to make all of the other steroids. If we don't have cholesterol in our body, we can't make all these other steroids, many of which are hormones in our body. Cholesterol itself has a couple of important functions. It's also important in cell membranes, just like phospholipids. So it helps cell membranes become a little bit more solid, less fluid. I'll talk about that, but cholesterol molecules are embedded into cell membranes, and they help hold those phospholipids in place. Cholesterol is also really important in the functioning of our nervous system, which we'll get into way later in the semester when we're talking about the nervous system. But we need cholesterol for a number of different bodily functions. From cholesterol, a lot of steroids. We have a lot of steroids in the body. These are probably some maybe you've heard of. Does anyone know what cortisol is? It's the something hormone. Stress hormone. Yeah. If you're really stressed out, your body's producing a bunch of cortisol. Not always good. Sometimes it can be helpful for short periods, but prolonged production of cortisol can have some negative effects on the body. So cortisol is a stress hormone. Progesterone and estrogen are both female sex hormones. Testosterone, typically a male sex hormone. So lots of different hormones are steroids. They all come from cholesterol. They're all made from cholesterol. I think that's all I have on lipids. Any questions before I move on? If I'm going too fast, let me know. Like I said, I think everyone's pretty okay. All right, proteins. To make a protein, you have to have a bunch of amino acids. So there's 20 different amino acids Those are the monomers of proteins. The order in which they're strung together and then how they're folded on top of themselves is going to determine what protein is actually formed and the function of that protein. The structure of an amino acid is pretty simple, I guess, relatively. It's not a huge molecule. You have a central carbon. Off of one side, you have the amino group, hence amino acid. That's our NH2. That's one of the functional groups you need to know. Off the other side, you have a carboxyl group, C double bond to O and then an OH. This makes it acidic. You don't need to know that, but that's where amino acid comes from. So amino carboxyls are acidic. Off of the third side, you have what's called the R group or the R side chain. And this is what makes each amino acid different. So all amino acids have this top 3/4 essentially the same: amino, hydrogen, carboxyl. Off of here, this is just kind of a placeholder, but there's a bunch of other elements and atoms coming off of here that you can imagine. We're not going to talk about the differences of the 20 amino acids, but for each amino acid, this whole area is different. R is just a placeholder. So don't think R is like an element. But that's what gives each amino acid its unique characteristics, the R side chain. I'm going to talk about some functions of proteins because they're so critical in our bodies, and a lot of these will come up in the next few chapters. So I want to mention, I'm not going to talk about all of the functions of proteins. Again, I'm going to focus on the ones that we'll see again. First off, structure. They're really important in the structure of different tissues in the body. So keratin and collagen. You've probably heard those terms. They're like all the rage in shampoos, and you can get collagen injected into your body if you need more collagen. So they're important from a structural standpoint, mostly on the outer surface or fairly superficial surface of the body. Keratin is really tough. This will come back up when we talk about the integumentary system, so the skin, hair, and nails. It's a really tough protein. Collagen is fairly tough as well. You'll see that this week in lab. You'll see collagen fibers on some slides of tissues when we talk about cartilage tissue. So keratin and collagen, both proteins. Proteins are also important in communication. So this could be cell-to-cell signaling molecules. So kind of adjacent cells are talking to each other, or more widespread, a lot of hormones or proteins. So hormones can fall into, like I said, there are a lot of lipids that we talked about. There's also protein hormones. And hormones are just chemicals that get sent around the body to take a message from one area to another. On the outsides of cells, there are also proteins that will receive signals. So proteins get sent around as signals, and then there's also proteins sticking off the top of cells that will accept, say, a hormone that comes to it, and that'll send the signal inside the cell. So lots of communication purposes. Membrane transport, so still with the cell membrane I'm talking about. Not only do they accept signals, they'll also allow the passage of material into and out of the cell. When we get into the structure of the plasma membrane in the next chapter, you'll see that not everything can just come and go from the cell willy-nilly. These proteins are letting very specific things in and letting very specific things out of the cell. They're also important in chemical reactions as enzymes. So the enzymes in our body that we're going to be concerned with are all proteins. So for our purposes, all enzymes are proteins. And enzymes, without getting into too much detail about this, I'm not going to go into too much about enzymes here, but they speed up chemical reactions. So they make all of those anabolic and catabolic reactions that I talked about happen a little bit more efficiently, or a lot of them happen more efficiently and quicker. And finally, proteins are really important in our immune system. Antibodies, if you've heard of antibodies, which I think everyone has at this point. Antibodies are just proteins floating around in our blood. They're trying to identify any invading cell or virus that comes into the body. So antibodies are proteins, really important. And then a fairly timely example of a protein on the outside of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So viruses don't technically have cells because they're not alive, but on the outside of what they call a cell, a viral cell, there's this really complicated protein, glycoprotein. So it has carbohydrates on it too, but it's a really complicated protein on the surface of the cells that cause COVID. And this is what actually allows, this protein is what allows it to get into a person's body cells. So not really from our perspective, it's not, hopefully, I mean, it's pretty much everywhere now, but we're not making these, but other viruses also have these important proteins that allow for kind of getting around our immune system. And this is what a lot of the vaccines actually detect, and then that's how our immune systems identify the viral cells, by seeing this really complicated protein, and then they'll attack it and kill it. If you've had it, your body knows how to identify it. If you've had a vaccine, your body knows how to identify that as well, ideally. Okay. Those are the functions of proteins I want you to know. On to the last major category, nucleic acids. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We're not going to get into a ton of detail about DNA replication and transcription and translation. I cut that chapter out just in the interest of time, but I do want you to know some basics about nucleic acids, since they're one of the major macromolecule categories. Here we're talking DNA and RNA. Does anyone remember, I don't think I have this on the slides, what DNA stands for? Nice. Yeah, deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA is just ribonucleic acid. So I'll talk about where those pieces of those terms come from in just a second, but do know generally what they stand for. I'm not going to ask you, but you should know deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid if you're going to stay in the sciences at all. Okay, so a nucleic acid is the polymer. The monomer is a nucleotide. So one piece is a nucleotide. String a bunch of those together, you get RNA. If you put two of those strings together, you get DNA. So DNA and RNA are really complicated, in part because a nucleotide actually has three pieces as well. So every single nucleotide has a nitrogenous base, and I'll show you a diagram of this on the next slide. So lots of nitrogen, a monosaccharide. What major group of macromolecules is that we talked about? Carbohydrate, yeah. Monosaccharide, carbohydrates. And then phosphate groups. So it can have 1, 2, 3, 4, one or more phosphate groups attached. All of these pieces make one nucleotide. So it's a complicated monomer. Everyone remembers ATP, right? The energy source for cells. So your cells are basically running off of ATP. It is a nucleotide. So most of the nucleotides string together to form DNA and RNA. We're not really going to talk about any other individual nucleotides other than ATP. So ATP is one you want to know. It's a nucleotide. It's the energy source for cells. And you want to know what it stands for, adenosine triphosphate. So how many phosphate groups do you think it has? 3, right? So it has 3 phosphate groups on it. That's where the energy basically comes from. Okay, so let's look at a nucleotide. I think I have ATP on the next slide. And I'll show you these three different parts of a nucleotide. Phosphate group, so this is ATP, this is another nucleotide. ATP, 3 phosphates. The nitrogenous group is up here. This is that AGTC, if you remember about DNA, where those kind of match up. Nitrogenous group is either a single or double nitrogen ring, but you can see the nitrogens, hence nitrogenous base. And then this is going to be the sugar, so the monosaccharide. In RNA and DNA, it's always ribose. You don't need to know that, but this is the monosaccharide, nitrogenous base, phosphate groups. Over here, we just have one phosphate group, but still a sugar and a nitrogenous base. Okay. Questions about that? Okay, so put your notes away for a few minutes. I have a little mini quiz. See how much of that you remembered. This is not worth the grade. You don't have to write it down. You can if you want to. I don't have this slide on Canvas, but I'll put it up there. And the answers are in the notes section at the bottom in case you want to go back and look at it. It's just like, I think it's 5 questions. Just some of the basics to kind of get you thinking. All right, let's start with triglycerides. So triglycerides, well, first off, what category do they fall into? 4. What are they? Lipids. So triglyceride is a lipid. 3 fatty acid chains attached to what? Anyone remember? Yeah. Glycerol? Yeah, glycerol backbone. So glycerol backbone has 3 carbons. You want to know that a triglyceride has 3 fatty acid chains. It's connected to a glycerol backbone. What are the monomers of proteins? Can't hear now, so we'll have to speak up. Proteins. What? Amino acid, I think I heard. Amino acids, the monomers of proteins. You want to know the monomers of carbohydrates and nucleic acids as well, so keep those in mind. Which type of carbohydrate does lactose belong to? Is it a mono, di, or polysaccharide? Is it right above me? It's a disaccharide. Cool, I was kind of blocking it. It's a disaccharide. It is made up of glucose and galactose. This one I totally spaced on this morning. Couldn't remember one of them. Which of the 4 main categories of these molecules have phosphate groups? Phospholipids, yeah, I blanked on lipids this morning. So lipids have phosphate. And then what else has a phosphate group? At least one. Nucleic acids, yeah, nucleic acids. Remember, that's one of the 3 pieces of a nucleic acid. Okay, so phosphate is found in those 2 major categories, nucleic acids and lipids, specifically phospholipids. And then what are enzymes? What do they fall into? Proteins, yeah, enzymes are proteins. Awesome. So this gives you sort of an idea of the types of questions I'd ask on an exam. It would be multiple choice or matching. So you'd have some options, but this is kind of the level of understanding that I want you guys to be at. Any questions about that? All right. I guess we'll stop there. I got a little further this morning, but that's okay. I'll see you guys either Wednesday or tomorrow.